Does anybody have the prompt handy?
I am pulling it up right now. So for this week, as this week's
timer too. I got the timer.
I started one.
Okay. So this week's prompt, as this week's readings and lectures focused on the various approaches to studying leadership, please discuss with your group which perspective or approach made the most sense to you. In considering the approaches and theories presented, think about your own beliefs about leadership and how leaders can motivate followers to achieve goals. So that is kind of the jumping off point.
So I guess we'll just jump into the leadership models, or the 5 approaches anyway. So when we were talking last week about leadership, I feel like it's all on a continuum, and that there's never any one, like any person isn't just one sort of leader. Don't communicate one sort of way. I think we talked about last week how different situations are going to dictate different responses. So like this week, looking at the different approaches, there's the traits approach, which means, or which talks about how somebody is born with these traits, but without some kind of action behind those traits, it doesn't really lend itself to good leadership. So then there's the situational, and you go into all the other approaches. So my point being, I feel like they're more on a continuum rather than somebody being one type of leader.
Yeah, I agree. And the book used a term for that. It was called path goal theory, I think, where it was the 2 most important things for leadership were the nature of the problem. I don't think that was the word, but the nature of the situation and the nature of the followers.
Yeah, nature of the followers and the nature of the tasks.
Yeah. So I think that goes back to everything we talked about last week, really, where it was depending on who's working and what they're working for, and a good leader adjusts to that.
I think the book talks about too how a leader who is effective in one situation, so the situational approach, they're not necessarily a good leader in another situation. I forget which president it mentioned, but that president, an effective military leader, but he was seen as inept as a president.
Yeah, I think that they kind of I think that the theories, like there's some truth behind all of them, obviously, but I don't think like any single theory is like the explanation of what it is, right? So like in terms of like the trait approach to leadership, I think almost everybody would agree that there are certain traits that if you have as an individual, it may make it easier, or you may be more naturally inclined to assume a leadership position, but that doesn't mean that somebody who doesn't naturally have those traits can't learn them. And that kind of goes into the situational approach, where depending on the situation, some of those traits may make you more successful innately, but anybody, if they have the desire, can really learn those traits at least to a level where they can be effective as a leader.
Yeah. Obviously, they wouldn't, if it was just you're born a leader, they just round up a bunch of 6-year-olds or something.
Right.
Leaders. Wouldn't have a million classes on it. And I mean, definitely, and everything's different. There's always some other aspect that you can learn from each class, because there's just so many different ways to do anything. I think that's really important to being a leader too. And reading about transformational leadership, it talks about being creative. And I think now they use innovative instead of creative. That's like more of a corporate buzzword, but being creative and not like just following the status quo and coming up with new ideas and new ways to solve problems. And I think that's really important too. And I think you can be taught that. You can be taught to approach things from different angles and to think through things and to problem solve. So, yeah. I definitely think that's important, though. And especially leaders, I don't think leaders are effective when they just follow the status quo and just kind of try to get by.
And you kind of get, you look at a lot of them, they have that, it's not just the status quo, it's they've got the vision. They've got somewhere in their mind of this is where we're going. And it's communicating that to everybody else so that everybody gets on board. They're like, oh, yeah, we're going there. Let's go. Come on.
Yeah. Hoorah.
I think the biggest thing, honestly, and I'm sure the book says it a million times and everybody says it, but communication is the most important part of being a leader. 100%.
Well, I talked to somebody that I know that they're a relationship counselor, and she's a friend of mine that I've known forever, and she was telling me, we were having a conversation one time about the 3 big things in just a marriage that lead to the failure of a marriage. And I think she said, we talk about it in church too, where it's communication, sex, and money. And so we were talking about communication, and she goes, communication is only as good as mutual understanding. So if you, like, we can communicate all day long, but then, you get into like the 5 love languages or whatever. And if you guys you guys, meaning you and your followers or subordinates, aren't speaking a similar language, not necessarily a love language, but if they're a kinesthetic learner and you're an audiovisual teacher, that's not gonna jive. So the book, this book and other classes, and I think it's maybe even more of a generational thing now, there's a big focus on relationships and forming those relationships with people who aren't feeling. I think that's with the communication is the relationships.
Well, yeah, but part of being an effective communicator too is having that what do they call it, like a emotional IQ or
emotional intelligence, or
where you can find out what they need to hear. I think that's all communication skills, recognizing in others. It's a little different because, like, as a leader, overseeing people, it's not like a husband, wife, or whatever, where you necessarily have to agree on everything. No, I understand. I liked your analogy, but I mean,
that's all I got right now.
Another huge part about being a leader is being able to adapt to your environment and the people around you. So also being able to teach that somebody who has a different learning style than you, so a little bit of adapting to them.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think getting back to Michael's point a little bit about having the vision and then being able to communicate that vision, and then in communicate that vision, being able to provide the motivation for your followers to want to follow through on and enact it. It takes that kind of adaptability where you can kind of figure out what it is that motivates the individual people, in your group, because not everybody's going to respond the same way to the same type of motivation. So I think it's kind of important for the leader to be able to adapt their style based on that individual in order to get the most out of them for the whole team.
Yeah, and definitely going back to communication skills, have you ever been in, like, you can have a leader talking and have this great vision and stuff, but have you ever been in a lecture or something and you're just like, what's this guy talking about? Like, so he has to be able to effectively communicate his vision too, not just have one.
Or even where you're like, wow, that sounds really awesome. How the heck are we supposed to get there?
Yeah, what?
Now what?
Well, you look at Tesla and Edison. Tesla was kind of a misanthrope, and he had great ideas, and they kind of got shoved off on the side. And Edison was a better communicator and more of a leader type and pulling people together. And we pretty much adopted his whole electricity scheme because of that. And, that's one where just a little bit of communication, leadership just basically changed the entire dynamic of our power grid.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And, with me, I'm a Coast Guard public affairs specialist. So, it comes from that military mindset of, hey, you come together, you do a job. It's a very functional approach. You don't have a lot of complaining or anything. Everybody raised their hand and said, we're here to do a job. And so people kind of get on board like that. But you do see better leaders than others. There was a guy named Dean Lee, and he was an admiral, and he was the kind where he would we'd do a PT test and he'd show up. and he'd run with everybody.
Why?
And stuff like that, where he created that relationship with everybody and that connection. And so it made him a better functional leader because he would show up on the ground.
You liked that when he did that?
What was that?
I was only in for 5 years, but you liked when he did that? If like if like a full bird showed up anywhere near us, we'd just be like,
Well, I'm as a PA, I'm stuck on their staff. So I've worked for I think 12 different admirals, and it's the kind where they'd roll into my office all the time. So you get used to it after a while.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've had commandants that know me by first name. So it's odd and it's weird. Like as an E4, they were like, "Hey," and you're like, "Morning, Admiral," but you get used to it. But he's one of those guys. Yeah, he'd throw on a plate carrier and jump in the pool for water survival training, and it was really he was just one of those guys. So
well, I guess that comes with being accessible too. I definitely never had any accessible leaders. I was only in for 5 years though, and I was infantry too, so that's a little different. But yeah, that's when you hide around.
I didn't get that option. It probably would have been better if I had, but yeah, it would be like, all right, I mean, take pictures, go.
Yeah, the infantry comparison would be though it's probably more apt if you're like in a line platoon as an infantryman. You know, if you've got your platoon sergeant or somebody a little bit lower that's a little more that you have a little more interaction with, and they're out there, you know, with you on a daily basis, that makes a little bit more impact. I definitely get that from the line unit perspective. But I think in terms of military, I think in terms of leadership, I think that it's interesting. A lot of the most effective leaders I had was those that were, because you think of the leadership as being more authoritarian a lot of times, right? Like you get orders, you get your marching orders, and you go. And a lot of the most effective leaders I had, they understood how to walk the line where you're like, there's going to be certain times where I'm going to tell you we're going to go do this, and you just have to go do it right now, and it's going to get done. But there's a lot of other times in the day-to-day operations where I will actually listen to your feedback. I will take your suggestions. I will take your ideas because you do have positive things to bring to the group. And the ones that are able to kind of walk that line where they know which style to flex to at different times, I found to be the most effective leaders I had.
It honestly sounds like we all agree that situational leadership is the best with like the path goal, following what's happening and who's involved and keeping an eye on those two things. And that's the most important in the path goal style. And I mean, that's both meetings. We've talked about that pretty consistently. And I mean, it's very intuitive though. I mean, people are different and every situation's different. Nothing works 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm. And you know, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
No, go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, well, I just got off shift, so I work a lot in situational leadership styles. So we run a very 911 heavy system here in my hometown. And one thing, I guess the other day we had a call, a 911 call, and it was an awful call, but because of how great my partner was at, you know, commanding the situation and getting under control and just everything was going wrong, but he was still that leadership role. He was still getting us to do everything that we needed to do and work together. And we ended up actually transporting the patient to the hospital, which is something we didn't think we were going to do. So, and I think that had a lot to do with how great he was at coaching everybody through what they were doing and delegating tasks and everything like that. So I work a lot with the situational leadership and I really prefer it, I guess. So.
Yeah, I think we're in unanimous agreement on that. You can't treat every situation the same. It makes no sense to do that. I don't know.
Well, and I think with that too, a good leader, I mean, it doesn't have to be a formal leadership. I think we talked about it last week where, you know, a lot of times really effective leadership comes from those that are in informal leadership positions and they kind of rise to the occasion. And, you know, in the situation that Jessica was just describing, maybe it's not somebody that's in command of the team all of the time, but it's somebody who just happens to excel in a really traumatic, really high intensity situation. I mean, you know, different people respond differently. And so I think an effective leader overall will draw that out of the people that they're working with. And,
Definitely.
yeah.
And we talked about leading up and everything last week too. So that's all possible. I didn't mean to cut you off if I did.
Oh, no,
I thought you were wrapping up.
No, I could talk in circles. That's kind of a downfall of me. So thanks, actually.
Okay. Was there anything else, or I think we covered everything for this week.
Cool.
All right. Let's just over text. All you have to do is text that one word you want to work on, and we'll put it together and submit it for next week too. I think it's due Tuesday. So.
Yep.
Okay.
So yeah, the list is in that in the assignment description. So we can just kind of take a look. We'll make sure we've all got a unique term, and we can start looking into it on our own, and then we'll kind of come back next week. And
Sounds good.
Sounds great. Happy Easter, everyone.
absolutely.
Happy Easter.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Talk to you later.